What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Weekend Roundup here on Touchline Talk. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out every single week. If you are looking for NWSL final recap and analysis, I have an entire different video dedicated to that, so be sure to check that video out as well. The topic for this one is really two different parts, starting with that 4-4 thriller between Manchester City and Chelsea. And there's really only one thing I want to get at with this game, and that is when Mauricio Pochettino's Spurs knocked Pep Guardiola's Manchester City out of the Champions League. One of the big narratives coming out of that was that Manchester City didn't know how to handle chaos, didn't know what to do when they didn't have control. And then you saw that play out in other Champions League runs, most notably that loss to Lyon, and it became a thing because it was a thing. And over the past two seasons in particular, but especially last season, that went away because of the tactical evolution that City have gone through, the way that they're now using their defenders as extra midfielders and extra attackers to have even more control. It is all working. It is not a fair criticism anymore. It wasn't a fair criticism when they lost to Real Madrid, and obviously it wasn't a fair criticism last season because they won the Champions League. It is not an accident that when they figured out how to navigate some of that, they became more multi-dimensional. They figured out how to even get to another level of control. They actually won the Champions League. There is a reason for that, I firmly believe. I've talked about this and talked about this and talked about this. So you haven't seen one of these wild, out-of-control games for a long time from City. And Mauricio Pochettino comes back to the Premier League, and here you go. Completely out-of-control game. And part of this is the fact that Pep Guardiola didn't start two holding midfielders, so Rodri was left on his own. That certainly didn't help. But you just don't see City look like this anymore. And credit to Chelsea, they took full advantage. Some really good performances by former Manchester City players. They go down. They find a way to claw back a couple times. It looks like City have a winner. They draw the penalty. Cole Palmer buries it. This game had a little bit of everything. But that's the fascinating part of this for me. Is this going to be a thing for City again? Because it looked like they had figured out how to avoid this. And then you get into this game and right, it's a Chelsea team that's squarely mid-table. Obviously, they have a lot of talent, but it's not like this is a title contender here, where sometimes great teams just cause you a lot of problems. That's not what Chelsea have been this season. So maybe this is just a Poch thing, where he knows how to push the right buttons to create this kind of chaos that makes Manchester City so uncomfortable. Maybe it's just a strange confluence of events that came together and we don't see something like this again. But I am now intrigued by this. Not necessarily in the Premier League title race, because over 38 games, it just doesn't matter that much. Yes, it keeps Arsenal and Liverpool right there in the title race. It's good for the league. It's good for the title race. My bigger question here is in terms of City and the Champions League. Because it is a completely different situation when you are in a knockout tournament like that, and you have to be able to go to plan B. You have to be able to deal with unpredictability. If this is going to become a thing again, it doesn't matter if they're more talented than everybody else. Or else they would have won 3, 4, 5 Champions Leagues by now. It doesn't mean they can't win it. But it is much, much more difficult to do so when you can't just either keep things the way you want them or be able to adapt, because inevitably things are going to go wrong at times. And that's what was so impressive about City last season, and to a certain extent the season before. They figured out how to do that part of it. They figured out how to just score a goal when they needed to. Rodri delivers in the final. You can go down the list. It didn't get unhinged like this. And so I just assumed we weren't going to get very much of this anymore. Chelsea showed it is still possible to have this kind of game against City. The question is this an outlier, or is this something that is going to become a theme again? Because if it is, there's a different conversation that needs to be had about the Champions League. But we're not there yet. It's one game, a phenomenal, entertaining game. One game in the Premier League, but Chelsea get a point against Manchester City. The other thing, haven't gotten to talk too much about the MLS playoffs, so finally have an opportunity to do that now that the quarterfinals are set. The big takeaway from this best of 3 round for me is kind of twofold. It did its job. I don't think you can really look at any of these and say the better team didn't win. Just going down the list here, Cincinnati absolutely deserved to go through over the 2 games. I know they had to go to penalties to do it, but you can't argue with that at all. Orlando certainly deserved to go through. Didn't have too much difficulty. Columbus, over 270 minutes, definitely deserved to go through. The Union took care of business. That's the Eastern Conference. Western Conference, Sporting Kansas City were clearly the better team. They might just be the better team. As good of a season as St. Louis City had. I've been really high on this Kansas City team all season. Finally, they're making me look justified in continuing to believe in them. Took a while, but they are incredibly dangerous. So no complaints there. Then Seattle, not exactly pretty, but again, the better team over the 3 games. They got the job done at home. You go from Seattle to LAFC, absolutely no question there. Certainly the better team. And then Houston, Real Salt Lake. I mean, RSL needed penalties to even have a chance in this series. Now, the games themselves were very, very competitive. It's not like RSL were thoroughly outplayed, but ultimately they were trying to come from behind. They needed penalties. Those are the kind of games that you can steal, and RSL have stolen in the past. It's much more difficult to do that with these 3 games. And so, from a better team winning, right team moving on standpoint, absolutely this worked. The interesting part is it didn't necessarily actually benefit the higher seeds. And what I mean by that is a lot of them won that first home game. We didn't have a lot of weird results that you usually do in the MLS playoffs. Kansas City went into St. Louis and won. And that was about it. Then you had some teams win it, some lower seeded teams win at home in game 2 and force game 3. But really, if you just would have played a one-off, the better team would have, the team that deserved to win would have won all 8 of those as well, probably. So it didn't actually reward the best teams by giving them a kind of a mulligan if something goes wrong, because they didn't need it. So it was very interesting in that sense that it's not like the story really changed from game 1 to game 2 and game 3. The better teams either won in 2 games or 3. And so now we have, for me, absolutely the right 8 teams left. Really looking forward to this next round of matchups. Plenty more to come on that after the international break. But that is all for the weekend roundup today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you next time.